and go into record, and then we can go through the motions. So what is our responsibility, right? If we are in a situation that we represent, and guess what? You're probably going to be on a lease, you're going to represent both parties. That typically happens, right? Because most agents don't want to put the time, effort, and energy because they have to still go through that motion of setting appointments, showing properties for the amount of money that they make. Sometimes it's not worth it for an agent. So most of the times the tenants are offending themselves and calling the agent directly. So in this case, you will probably be representing that tenant, right? As the listing agent leasing out a property, you're going to be getting calls from potential tenants, right? Now, the beautiful thing about what has transpired last year is you could or you couldn't, if you don't want to, represent a tenant. That's why we have the agreement that says for an unrepresented individual. Okay. Now, I want to caution you that as well. Most individual agents want to get more income, and that's where the listing agreement has the information, right? That says that to the landlord, hey, if I end up representing the tenant, I'm asking for additional compensation, and that's perfectly fine, okay? Because there is additional paperwork that you need to do to get to the finish line, right? To get the deal leased out, closed out, you get paid, the tenant moves in, the landlord gets a qualified tenant. An individual agent who represents both parties to a real property. In this case, again, I want to emphasize this is based on a buyer-seller transaction, but I wanted to use the emphasis on the importance of what we do as real estate professionals, right? Because there's a lot of information here that relates to leases, even though this is kind of geared more to a buyer-seller, but I wanted to emphasize the importance of how we navigate a conversation when you have a tenant in place, right? Because again, it's like a very delicate process. And the tenants are going to hold you accountable, right? If they don't get the application submitted or they feel that they don't, they immediately go sideways and believe that they're being discriminated. Okay. So one of the elements, you got to keep everything very neutral and everyone treated the same. Does that make sense? Okay. No bias, no discrimination whatsoever. Everyone is equal when an application comes in, right? Each individual agent from a brokerage firm that represents both parties to a transaction, even if each works exclusively with one side, right? So we're going to go through a scenario, right? And that scenario is this. You list the property, right, as a lease. It's a single family home. And you've taken the photography, all of the images, you priced it, the rental fair market rent, and it goes active, right? Now you start getting the calls, right? You get a call from an applicant, that reaches out to you and says, hey, I happen to see the property on 123 ABC Street. Is that property still available? Okay, and if the property is available, then you're going to say, yes. How can I help you regarding this, right? Well, I'd like to know what the initial process to submit a request for an approval. I'd like to rent this place out, right? What is the first thing you must do? Say again?
Do you have any?
Do you have what?
They have an agent.
Yeah. Ask, are you working with any real estate agent, right? Because sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, right? Maybe they just happen to see your property on the website and they are being represented. So the first thing is ask, hey, are you working with a real estate professional or an agent, right? The answer is no, I'm not. Okay, so then what should be the next question? What should be the next question regarding your position when you are the listing agent on a lease property on a single family residence, right? And I'm going through this conversational aspect of it because this is real life scenarios that can happen to you. Anyone?
Would you be interested in representing you in this transaction?
Okay, yeah, I mean, the next step would be this, okay, maybe I can push a little bit. It's, why don't we set an appointment to see the property, right? And so what you want to do is to make sure how serious this individual, can you start asking qualified questions to this potential tenant over the phone? You cannot, or you wouldn't? Okay, why wouldn't you?
Because I would like to, if I make the appointment, I'd like to do that when I get the appointment with them.
Okay.
Instead of just asking them on the phone and then.
So what you're telling me is you wouldn't start asking qualified questions over the phone. You would go through the motions of setting a time to go see the property, show the property, and then you find out that that individual doesn't even qualify.
Oh, no, I would.
Yeah, you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I would do is start asking qualified questions. You know, where do you currently reside? You know, what's the reason behind wanting to move? These are all neutral conversations you can have with a tenant, which is perfectly fine. It does not go anywhere where it's discriminatorial, right? It doesn't go in that direction. All we're doing is just trying to get a good sense and understanding, right? Where this individual is at the current position, right? What is the reason and the intent of all this, right? Because you want to get a good understanding before you either present with an application, but also to kind of understand a little bit of their history, okay? But even more so, folks, okay? You're not going to say, oh, I don't think you qualify, right? Because you're not going to be in a position to say, based on the language or whatever the tenant is saying to you over the phone, an indicator that says, oh, I don't think you would qualify for this particular home. You got to go through the motions and process, right? And that process is, you know, once you get a good understanding of where they're coming from, then the next step would be is to show the property. And if they had any questions, then the next step is, are you still interested in submitting an application? And if the answer is yes, you hand them an application, right? And then that starts the process, right? At the same time, you may be getting other calls from other potential tenants who are either being represented by an agent or not. You're going to gather all of this because all of this applications that you're receiving is going to go to who? The landlord, right? The landlord. So in theory, you know, you gotta be very, very careful in how you initiate all this, because the minute someone feels that it's compromising or they feel that there is some bias to it, that's where you get the complaint, and that's where it may potentially go sideways really quick. I don't know what it is with leases, but we see this quite often, and it's a very sensitive process. So you as a real estate agent need to know how to walk that dance, right? And be neutral with everything that you do, every step of the way. And ultimately, whoever is the most qualified applicant to be able to lease the place on a month-to-month or a one-year lease. Okay. So far, everyone's on the same page here, right? Okay. Let me show you the checklist. People on Zoom, do you see the checklist?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So this is our typical standard residential lease checklist. Okay. Lot of information. 1 second, someone has someone. Okay, thank you so much. Lot of information here, right? This is all part of our KW hub. If you go to the KW South Bay hub, the KW Coastal hub, or the KW PV hub, you're going to be able to go into the resource and download the checklist for leases. Now, there's a lot of paperwork just for a lease, right? But the reason there's a lot of documentation is because there's a lot of litigations happening right now as we speak. So this is the reason you have to make sure that you have all of your ducks in on row, right? Everything in position in case this goes sideways. We need to know what transpired, how we got here, and what documentations was executed, right, or signed. It starts off with the agency disclosure, right? That's a mutual agreement between you as the agent and the tenant that you are representing, right? Or the landlord in this case. You need to have a lease listing agreement, right? If you are representing a landlord, the initial process of having a lease listing agreement. The California Consumer Privacy Act advisory, that's attached already to the lease listing agreement, right? Because of all of the issues that have transpired since COVID, right? COVID dramatically changed the way landlord and tenant obligations are, and more so Southern California, or the state of California, I should say, was a lot geared to protecting the tenant. So all of these consumer advisories is a disclaimer and disclosure that will protect you and the consumer that we are doing the right thing and not being biased about the process, but we're being very neutral. But here's a disclaimer. Here are the advisories that state that. Okay. Rental property owner disclosures, any modification of terms, the lease rental commission agreement, broker compensation agreement. When you are representing a tenant, right, and you are have a tenant representation agreement, TRBC form, the tenant is responsible to pay you compensation, kind of similar to submitting a regular offer, right? So what the tenant's obligation is, they are responsible to pay you compensation for you to identify, negotiate, and submit an application and get a property leased for your client. And in return, for successfully doing so, you earn compensation. Now, no difference in a regular traditional sale. The TRBC also says that if anyone other than the tenant pays you compensation, that credits the tenant's obligation to pay you a commission. So when you submit the paperwork, you're also going to submit a request from the landlord to pay you, right, as the agent representing the tenant. And let's say that you put 3% that you're asking for compensation. You're going to go and submit the application and all of your advisories, your agency agreement, right, that you have representation with this tenant. That gets submitted to the listing agent. They go through the motions of it, right? And they agree to your compensation, right? Even though this is not a traditional sale, you're still doing work for compensation. Now, the tenant can pay you as well. Let's just say that the owner says, we're not going to pay the agent any compensation. Therefore, the tenant would be responsible to pay you your compensation, right? Now, real estate commissions are all negotiable, meaning whatever you and the landlord or you and the tenant come to an agreement, that's between you guys. That's your negotiations. If it's a flat fee or if it's a percentage, right? Now, I hear many different things regarding many different scenarios. Okay. Is I hear mostly, how do we determine compensation on a lease, right? Is it based on the actual rent? Can I ask for 1 month's rent as compensation? That's one question I get. The other is it a total annual income? Based on the total annual income, can I get a percentage of that? Okay. Or can it be a flat fee? I'm asking for a flat fee based on all of the work that I put into this, right? So that can be also the same situation, right? All of it is negotiable. Most standard that I see across the board, it's the total income for the entire year based on a percentage. So let's say, theoretically speaking, that the rental is $3,000 a month, right? If you do the arithmetic, 3,000 times 12 is what?
1222.
36,000, right? 36,000. Then you can calculate 36,000 times 3%. That would give you the amount that typically we see quite often in real estate commissions when it comes to leases. That's typical. Okay. But again, I just want to emphasize and stress that it's all negotiable. Whatever the agent and the landlord or the buyer is willing to pay you, and it's in an agreement, then that's perfectly fine, right? But it has to be reasonable too, right? It's all based on the income too, right? If a property is renting for $10,000 or $12,000, and there's homes out there that are renting for that much, right? That means you can negotiate a higher commission split as well. But I've also seen on the MLS, on the section of concessions where it doesn't have a yes or a no, right? Well, then you need to pick up the phone and ask, is the seller paying any type of concessions towards the obligation of the tenant, right? And that's perfectly fine to do so. Because sometimes the landlords will not pay any compensation, then the tenant would be responsible to pay you compensation. So I want you to understand every element and why documentation is vital and important, especially when working with a tenant, why you need that tenant representation agreement in place, because it positions yourself of an understanding of what you are asking or requiring as compensation for the services to get you a place to rent. Okay.
Simon,
Yes.
unlike the BRBC, when we look at the tenant representation agreement, it says that there is no option to be not exclusive. It only says that the exclusive right to represent the tenant in obtaining a lease or rental property. So if we add in the additional terms that this agreement is not exclusive, does this supersede the exclusivity part written in the contract?
Absolutely, yes. So the beautiful thing about all of these agreements, you can do what we call modifications, right? Everything is subject to modifications. You're 100% correct. Yeah, it is an exclusive agreement. An exclusive means that regardless in who finds and identifies and negotiates a place for the tenant, you're still entitled to some compensation. Okay. Or vice versa as well, too, when it comes to the landlord, right? This is why we have exclusive agreements, right? Because of past history, there's always been a misunderstanding in how these documentations work. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, so I'm not gonna go too into all of this. I'm gonna bypass a lot of stuff, but it also says, that you're gonna need a copy of the MLS printout. And again, this is only for your protection if this goes sideways, right? Why don't we need a stack of documentation, right? Well, the reason is if there's a dispute, there's a disagreement, there's a misunderstanding, then we can package this and articulate our position on why we're entitled to compensation as an example, right? Or that was not agreed upon, right? Sometimes the landlord believes it's this way where the tenant believes it's that way, right? So we have to know how to navigate this to come to some conclusion and agreement that both are satisfied. And if they're not, then we walk away. Maybe this is not the right home for us and we walk away. But the essence of today's lecture is really just to understand the initial process as you're going through this and get a good feeling and an understanding that, leases as simplistic, in my opinion, could be, it also can be very complex because it's easier to find a tenant than sometimes trying to find a qualified buyer, right? Because people are constantly looking to rent a place. So let's just say you do have a lease listing, you're definitely going to get a lot of activity, in my opinion, because people are constantly looking to rent a place, right? Now it's all based on location and also the cost, right? With everything that happened with the fires, right, in the beginning of the year, right? Gougy was one of the hot topics, right? And people were taking advantage of, hey, you know what? We're going to increase it 10,000 than the standard, right? Then the state of California, the county of Los Angeles, the cities stepped in. I know because we were receiving letters from individual agents that were supposedly in a position that they were doing price gouging, right? So you got to be very careful too, but also do your homework and your research because I think it's super vital and super important for you to understand. It's like running comps, right? It's like running comps. How you find comps is look at the MLS, go on the lease section of it, and then do comparables on a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home, 1,500 square feet on a 5,000 square lot. Look at what the area is renting for and go into the ones that have been leased. That's going to give you a good indicator, right? Now, there's other programs that you can purchase, like there's a website called Rento Meter, I think it's called Rento Meter with an O in between. Rento Meter. That gives you just plug in the address and it'll populate the information and it'll give you a gauge of what the amount you can rent. I can pull it up here on the website too if you want. Let's see, rent. I think it's called, let's see. Yeah, it's this website right here.
Yeah, that.
Okay, there is a cost to it, but this seems to be the most used platform, in my opinion, for rentals. People on Zoom, can you see the rental meter?
Yes.
Okay. So there is a price to it, but it also provides you with all kinds of great stuff with it. If you're heavily involved with, rentals, right? If you're not, then I would discourage you from doing and getting this package deal because you can also do it through the MLS as well, right? But this one, many years ago, used to be free. You used to put in the address and it would populate a gauge or a range, and it would say based on the location, the bedrooms and square footage, this is what you can possibly rent. And then you would compare apples to stuff on the MLS, and then that's how you would, interpret the amount. Okay. All right. Then the rest of the stuff is really more of disclosures, right? Lead-based paint, bed bugs, tenant flow hazard disclosures. If there is a death on the property, even on a rental, we have to disclose similar to a real estate sales transaction. So if anyone has passed away in the last 3 years from the time of the landlord putting the property on the market and going through the motions of finding a new tenant, and it's within that 3 years, then yes, the landlord has to disclose that there was a death on the property. Okay. Because I get this quite often is, well, I thought it was only for sale, real estate sales transactions that we have to disclose that tenant because the owner still owns the property. They're not selling the property. Why do we have to divulge that information to a tenant, right? Well, the answer is because people sometimes believe in superstitious, right? They feel that, they wouldn't have rented this place if they would have known that there was a death on the property. Does that make sense? So this is the reason we must disclose all that.
Simon, can I
Yes,
have a question? Even if the tenant didn't ask, or we have to disclose that even if he asked or he didn't ask, or only if he asked?
yeah, no, even if they do not ask and that someone passed away within the last 3 years, you have to disclose because here's the problem. Okay, here's the problem with that. The problem is, who do you think is going to tell that tenant when they move in, hey, by the way, did you know that about 6 months ago, the tenant here passed away of natural causes? Okay. The neighbors are the first to tell the tenant. And if the tenant finds out from the neighbor that was not divulged and disclosed, that's a problem. Because the tenant may have a right to now cancel the agreement. That's a good reason for them to cancel the lease agreement. If they have a 12-month lease agreement and they find out a month into living in the place that we did not divulge that within that time frame as part of the disclosure, the tenant has the right to cancel the agreement and not be penalized because they can use that as an argument that they were not privy to that information. We wouldn't have never rented the place if we knew someone had passed away. So if you know that information, then you need to put it in some type of documentation. Yes, sir.
Obviously, the source of the information has to be the owner of the property, right?
Absolutely, yes.
They don't disclose it.
Well, if they don't disclose it, they don't tell you, well, there's no way of knowing, right? This is why you go through the motions of explaining, hey, part of the initial process when we're going to lease to someone is, here's what we need to ask, has there been any death in the property? So this is where you have to have conversations with the landlord so the landlord knows and what are the issues with the property, right? The landlord needs to tell you if there's any issues such as plumbing issues, right? Anything that can be relevant, obviously the landlord needs to correct it or fix it because it's going to be a problem once the tenant, because tenants will be tenants, are going to immediately call, hey, this is not working. We just got another complaint on a refrigerator. The tenant moved in and complained that the refrigerator is not cooling. And the reason they know this is they just bought milk and then 3 days later, the milk went bad. So they're now asking the landlord to correct that or fix it or repair it or replace it. So if you know of circumstances and situations, then I would encourage you to please divulge and disclose that. Question?
Simon, certain HIV or AIDS related deaths, sometimes they're protected from having to disclose. Does this apply for leases?
100%. Yes, that's a good point. So the question is about death, right? That's on the property. And more so if it's related to HIV or AIDS, right? So it is considered a protected class. We don't have to divulge that information, okay, because it is protected class. But here's the thing. If they ask you as a direct question, okay, and I'm just throwing this out loud so anyone can speak on it on Zoom or in person. If a direct question is, how did that person pass away of? And knowing that it is a protective class, how do you answer and how do you address that? Yes.
Maybe somewhat, well, way that we can address that one is probably the saying, I don't know, but I think that's the responsible way to respond to that.
Okay, but you do know. You know that the person did pass away from HIV or
But
AIDS.
that happens also under HIPAA. And the HIPAA can, a health related situation, so you can say, I cannot disclose it because of HIPAA policy.
Okay, all right. Got it. So one says that because it's a protected class, meaning we should be obligated to disclose the reason behind their death, right? Anyone else on Zoom? Do they have a different approach or different idea? What I mean is if someone directly says, can you please tell me how this person passed away? It's a direct.
I would probably just say they passed away from an illness. I mean, it's still, you know, giving a reason, but it's not fully stating, you know, the protected class, like which kind of illness.
Yeah, okay. Anyone else?
Can you use the HIPAA, saying there could be a HIPAA violation if we disclose?
Yes. You most definitely can, because again, it goes back to, it's a protected class, right? Meaning it is a disability. So in essence, you have to be very sensitive about the circumstances and situation. But I would also caution you because it's considered a violation. And if you do divulge this information, you're compromising your position and someone can go after you, right? Because it is considered a disability. It's considered a violation. So unfortunately, even though you know that the person had passed away. Now, keep this in mind, right? If the owner gives you the authorization in writing, you're more than welcome to divulge the reason behind the death of the family, the death of the tenant, okay, and all that. You gotta kind of be careful in how you approach this, but you still gotta protect that element or environment, right? Unfortunately, the individual passed away of medical reasons. I cannot go into too much about it and leave it at that, right? Most people will put that together and realize the situation. But even if they want to come after you, it's a protected class. You have a strong defense regarding that because your job was to protect it, right? So they cannot knock you from doing so, right? But you're just going to still state the fact, yeah, someone passed away in the last 3 months. That you do say, okay? Yes.
Since we came up from COVID about 5 years ago, does the same apply to the COVID situation?
COVID situations. I don't think COVID is considered a protected class. So COVID is just a flu. Unfortunately, yes. I mean, a lot of people, we lost an agent in our office here due to COVID, So that's perfectly fine. I mean, I divulged that someone passed away and I said it was due to COVID. I don't think COVID is a protected class because it was considered like a flu symptom or disease, So I think you're perfectly fine to say that the person did pass away due to COVID. Because a lot of people unfortunately did pass away with that, so. Good points, good questions. Anyone else?
Simon?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I had a case previously and I didn't know how to deal with it,
Okay,
where I've signed a tenant representation agreement,
okay,
but on the way when we were applying to different places, I noticed that the tenant has a criminal record. So I was not sure on how to handle this. And yeah, what do you think on this?
got it. How did you know that there was a criminal record?
It's, when you apply to TransUnion, the rent spree, there's this TransUnion background check.
Okay,
And there was a report that was issued and it had this information.
can you go a little into more what it said? I'm curious. Do you remember?
It said that the person has a criminal record and it says the time and date and says something like misdemeanor. And it says it can be something like, maybe fighting with the neighbors or being too loud or being too noisy and something like this. And I think it's crucial because I don't also want to come to the other agent and tell them like, hey, the client that I'm representing has had exactly something that would really not be okay with the landlord.
Yeah. Well, remember, part of the initial process when it comes to leasing out a property, right? You want to get the most qualified individual, right? And anything that what's the word I want to use? Not necessarily discriminatory, but anything that may question, right? Question the ability from a position of discrimination, then you got to be very careful in how you approach this. But that's the whole purpose of having a qualifying checklist of what the landlord is looking for, right? Because at the end of the day, the landlord can rent out the place to whoever they want. Back credit, convicted individual, it's up to the landlord, right? And the landlord is the final decision maker in who they want to rent. Our job as a real estate professional is to give all of this information so the landlord can make a relevant decision in who they're going to choose, right? Because it's sometimes not the most qualified person. Maybe there was a connection from the owner and the tenant that they vibed. And they're willing to, because this is their property. They have every right to rent whoever they want. You're all with me on this, right?
Right.
So in theory it doesn't necessarily have to be the most qualified individual. It's the one that the landlord is willing to take. And they take responsibility because your job ends the moment it's executed, leased out. You're done. You clean your hands and you move on. Now the responsibility falls on both the tenant and landlord. Okay, that's their responsibility now. The landlord to reach out to the tenant to reach out to the landlord, not to us individuals anymore, because our job was done once we identified and secured that tenant. Okay. Now going back to your question, hold that thought. Going back to your question regarding this conviction, right? Remember, it's all about a process, right? And that process is many factors, right? One, do they have a job? Right? And if they don't, how are they surviving? How are they supporting themselves? Maybe they're getting alimony. Maybe they're getting Social Security. Maybe they're getting a pension. Maybe they're getting a voucher from Section 8. Many variables. Just because you don't have a job doesn't mean they don't qualify. This is why you have to ask all of the right questions, right? Because they may be making a lot of money and be a stay-home adult.
Mhm.
Maybe they have a severely handicapped individual that the state is paying them to take care of that child or that brother or sister. Because I've seen circumstances where we have one of our agents here, one of our agents has a severely disabled sister that he takes care of her. Okay. So that might be the source of income, and that's perfectly fine because remember, we're looking for the most qualified individual that can pay the rent at the end of the day. Okay. Now it cannot be money laundering, right? Because you got to know where the source of income is coming from, because then you compromise your client's property too, right? Because then the CIA may come and raid and says, well, we're taking the house too, because the landlord knew that this was money laundering, right? So you got to be very careful, but that's kind of extreme, right? But again, just based on the conversation, when you're going through the qualifying process, right? Income, job, credit, any convictions or evictions, right? Has this individual had any evictions, right? Is there a pattern, right? Anything that you can do to dissect to put them on the non-qualified parameter, because you want the most qualified applicant at the end of the day, folks. Does that make sense?
Sam, but if I'm representing the tenant this time, not the landlord, I'm like having an agreement with the tenant.
Got it.
Do I get the right to say that, kind of like say that I don't want to work because I don't think we meet the qualifications? Is this something I'm allowed to do? I don't know. It's a tough one, I know, but it happened.
Yeah. No. This is a good scenario. Thank you for sharing, because this helps all of us, right? And that can happen. You can be in a situation where it's a convicted felon, right? It's prison time, right? He or she is rehabilitated already, right? They've gone through it. They've learned. They're now back in society, but they have a criminal history. And now they're asking you, right, to be part of it. You got to be very careful, because they can use that as a way of saying discrimination, right? So you have to understand. So the way I would approach this, right, is one, always bring it to my attention as the broker or to leadership, right? If you feel uncomfortable, right? Because you may be spinning your wheels and wheels, submitting applications. Remember, the agreement that you have with the tenant is only good for how long? 3 months, right? The BRBC, the TRBC is 3 months. So after 3 months, it becomes an expired agreement where both mutually can agree. And sometimes you're not going to know this information until you're actually in the trenches of it, right? But you cannot say, I'm going to terminate because you're a convicted individual, right? Because that's a sensitive position where they could say, well, I disagree with you. I think you're discriminating me. I have a job. I have a good, credit score. Yes, it's tarnished. I made mistakes in the past, but that's not me. This is me now, right? So you cannot use that as an avenue to cancel that agreement, right? So you got to walk that delicately, right? And ultimately, as you ride the agreement until it expires, that's one option. Bring it to leadership, and we can help navigate that. I don't have the answer. I don't know. It really depends, right? Because there's some owners out there and landlords that are willing to take on someone because maybe they've had that experience too.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember, I shared a story with you that I allowed a tenant who lived in his vehicle. He was homeless, and I still believed in him. And he was one of the best tenants that I've ever had. And to this day, and he lived in that property for 3 years. And in the beginning, it was a little bump and bruise because he was a little late on his rent, but he was responsible. And I believed in this guy, and I gave him that opportunity. Again, I could have easily said, well, I don't know. His credit was okay. He had a job, a stable job. He had the income, but unfortunately, life circumstances, he was literally living in his car. And he told me that. I park around the corner where I work because he was a truck driver. And I sleep. And then when I need to go to the restroom or take a shower, I usually go to those trucking companies where you can have showers and all that. And he lived in his vehicle for at least 8 months, I believe. But I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I asked a lot of questions, but he gave me that good vibe, right? He gave me that good vibe, and I allowed it. And he was one of the best applicants, in my opinion. So I don't know, it really depends. Sometimes they may even get frustrated because you can do everything possible in your power, right? To submit applications. And when they run the background, they see that and they say, unfortunately, we ended up going in a different direction. They're going to also understand, it's going to be a little difficult too as well. It's tough. And a lot of people make mistakes in life, right? And now they're good people and doing everything in society to make up for it, right? And unfortunately, because of that tarnish, it may impact them from the ability to rent a place. I have no control over that, because again, from a landlord standpoint and a listing agent standpoint, you're providing the most qualified individual. And if there's some discrepancy or some tarnished on that, that may alter the ability for the tenant to get that place to rent, right? I don't know. All I'm saying is you gotta be careful in how you maneuver this, because all I'm saying is to protect you from a potential discriminatorial process where we see it quite often. We see it a lot with Section 8s right now. Okay, so if you do have a lease listing and someone reaches out to you and says, hey, do you accept Section 8 vouchers? The answer is
Yes.
Absolutely.
yes. Please submit your application. Okay, even though the owner may say, I'm not qualified or I don't want to take on Section 8, you have to be in the forefront of that conversation with the owner and says, look, unfortunately, I understand, that you don't want to take on Section 8, but I cannot say that to a tenant. They have to submit an application. And if they're still in disagreement, then maybe you don't need that listing, okay? Because it happens. And we have 2 cases that we ended up writing checks for $15,000 for a 2-minute conversation that led to the applicant saying, do you accept Section 8 vouchers? And unfortunately, the agent, not in a bad way, says, unfortunately, the landlord is not positioned for Section 8. That's it. Immediately within 2 weeks, we received a complaint letter from an attorney firm stating we're suing you for discrimination. So the essence and the question here is, you accept all applicants, okay? All applicants, regardless on how bad their application is. It's like a resume, right? You're the CEO of your firm and your company, but you're looking for a position, right? People are going to submit their resume, right? Then you're going to get all of the resumes and then now dissect which ones you want to go on the next step, right? For a face-to-face interview, which ones do not qualify, right? Now you're hoping that they'll know once they don't get a call back that they probably are aware that the application was not accepted, or they look at the MLS or some third-party website and see that the place has been leased. But it's those circumstances where you get a complaint or a follow-up. Hey, we submitted an application about 2 weeks. We haven't heard. I want to know what the status is, right? Now you have to do a follow-up on that, right? How do you tippy-toe around that conversation when you know they don't qualify, right? Or they did not pass through the first phase of the application process? So then you got to know and position yourself in how to navigate that conversation is. Okay, well, unfortunately, the landlord ended up going in a different direction. they ended up picking the most qualified applicant, right? And that most qualified applicant can mean many variables, right? Income stability, job, credit. Sometimes even, they have the means, they're willing to put additional security, right? And all of those elements to give the landlord that peace of mind that they had the most qualified person. Everything is, in my opinion, on a base-to-base situation, right? Because at the end, as I mentioned, it's the landlord's discretion and decision to pick the most qualified individual. Does that make sense? They're good questions. So,
Thank you.
thank you. I know it's a tough one when you're representing the tenant that has a discrepancy or a tarnish, I should say, on their background. Yeah, it's a tough situation to how to navigate it. I would do my very best. And, ultimately that tenant will probably realize that, you've done what you needed to do. It's just unfortunate, they may just decide to part ways. And then that gives you the exit, right? Where you did what you needed to do as a professional, but, unfortunately, because of that background issue, it's just really difficult. And you can be sincere about it and say to this tenant, look, I have a feeling that unfortunately, the reason we're having the challenges is because of your background, put yourself in a situation. I get it. You know what? We make mistakes and we've changed. Maybe the next level is writing a letter, right? And having a good letter explaining. Sometimes I've been in that situation, folks, where I want to meet the person before I see the application looks good, looks okay, looks bad. But if that's the only individual that I'm looking to consider, I still want to meet face to face. I want to know your character, your demeanor, how you approach the conversation. All of that gives me a good sound decision, right? If I'm going to go forward with it or not. Because on paper, it may look bad, right? But then when you actually meet, right, and what I mean is by your client, the landlords, they will make the final decision. It's like that interview process, right? And by meeting them face to face, sometimes it gives you a better sense and credibility that, you know what, I think we're making the right decision. And that's fine too, because that may be some of the steps and elements to get you to finalize that lease agreement. Okay. With that, it is 11:31. I want to respect each and everyone's time. Thank you. I appreciate you all who stuck around here. And if you have any additional questions, we can navigate it together. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm here as a resource. All of the leadership is there for resources and help. I appreciate you. Be safe and have a wonderful Friday and a good weekend. And I'll see you in the next contract class. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Simon.
Simon. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Simon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.